Okay, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, Congresswoman Bachmann, for organizing this, and thank you so much to all of the esteemed members of Congress who are coming here. Yeah, and in the middle of voting, so I really appreciate it, and I'll be brief. So my name is Caroline Glick, and as Congresswoman Bachmann said, I'm the senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post and the author of the Israeli Solution, a one-state plan for peace in the Middle East. I made Aliyah to Israel in 1991, and I served as an officer in the IDF for about 6 years. During the last 3 years of my service, I was a core member in Israel's negotiating team with the Palestinians on civil affairs in the military government. So I was a core member of Israel's negotiating team with the Palestinians at the height of the peace process, and was involved with negotiating 6 different agreements with the Palestinians over the course of those years. So I'm intimately involved as well with the negotiating process. And after I left the IDF, I served as Prime Minister Netanyahu's Assistant Foreign Policy Advisor during his first time as Israel's premier. I went into journalism in 2000, and I have been the senior columnist in the Jerusalem Post since 2002. And the contributing editor. In 2003, I had the privilege of being embedded with the U.S. and 3rd Infantry Division in the invasion of Iraq and Iraqi freedom. And all of these experiences that I've had in my professional life, as well as my life simply living in Israel, particularly since the Palestinians began their most recent terror campaign against Israel in late 2000, have really been brought to bear in this book. And I think, for many years I had colleagues saying, well, you should write about the peace process, you should write about the Palestinian issue, and I think that it took me 20 years to write about it, because it took me 20 years of experience to be able to think about it. I wouldn't say dispassionately, because it is, of course, the lives of myself and my family and my countrymen that are on the line here, but in a manner that allowed me to rationally look through what we've experienced, what I've experienced as an individual as well, and to come to the conclusion that not only as the Congresswoman and as you Congressman said, the two-state solution is a recipe for war and bloodshed and instability and inevitably the destruction of Israel.
You can go ahead and sit down if you want to. There's chairs there, so please go
but
ahead.
I will put this down.
Take a chair.
But for the inevitable destruction of Israel, so that the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is a policy that will lead inevitably, if it is actually fulfilled, to the destruction of America's most important ally in the Middle East and the establishment of a terrorist state, not unlike what we're seeing today in Syria and Libya and in Iraq. So this is a devastating situation that the United States now finds itself in, not to mention Israel. And the question is, what do we do? So the first part of my book gives a 360-degree analysis, not only of the 90 years of failure of the two-state solution policy paradigm since the time of the beginning of the British mandate for Palestine in 1920, but also how this has devastated American strategic thinking in the Middle East for the past 4 decades, really. And particularly for the past 2, since it's been the centerpiece of U.S. Middle East policy. And then the second part of my book says, okay, well then what should we do? Because I think one of the things that proponents of the two-state solution have been very successful in doing is intimidating people and saying, well, if not this, then what? What is your alternative to this? So, of course, the first rule of economics is if you find yourself digging yourself into a hole, you should stop digging, right? So first of all, let's stop with what we're doing. Let's end our devotion to the two-state formula. Let us defund entirely the Palestinian Authority, and most importantly and most acutely, thank you, it is an absolute imperative immediately to stop to stop funding the U.S. military training of the Palestinian military that has been going on since 2005. The United States is training a Palestinian terrorist army. These security forces have been at the forefront of all of the Palestinian terror waves against Israel since the inception of the Palestinian Authority in 1994. And this is a move that, despite the tactical gains that have accrued to the counter-terrorist campaign of Israel in recent years since Hamas ejected Fatah from Gaza in 2007, in the long term, this is a poison pill that will truly harm Israel. It is a military force that we have never faced from the Palestinians before, specifically because it is trained by the United States, and that simply has to end immediately. But beyond ending our digging process in this hole, what can we do? So one of the things that we've been told is that we have to continue digging, because if we don't continue digging ourselves into this hole, then Israel is going to be overwhelmed by Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria. And if Israel doesn't quit Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and throw out the 500,000 Jews who live in these areas, then we're going to be overwhelmed by the Palestinians who are going to demand citizenship. Israel will cease to be a Jewish state because there are so many of them. And this is simply not true. Like so many other things that we have been told about the two-state solution, it doesn't solve anything demographically for Israel. In fact, what it would do would be invite an unending of Israel's demographic majority west of the Jordan River by opening up the floodgates of Arab immigration into a state of Palestine on the west bank of the Jordan River. And these are not only people coming from UN refugee camps that have been run by terrorist organizations since their inception in the 1950s. It also involves simply bringing over jihadists from Iraq, from Libya, from Syria, who will join the campaign to liberate Palestine from the Jewish infidels. And that is the real existential demographic threat facing Israel. Obviously, demography is a side issue here because it would be a military threat that Israel, within shrunken borders, would be unable to surmount. But having said that, demography in and of itself of Judea and Samaria is not what you have been told. There are not 2.6 million Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria. There are more like 1.4 and up to 1.6 million Palestinians, so that if Israel were to incorporate that entire population inside of its population rolls, whether as permanent residents or as citizens of Israel, Israel would still have a two-thirds Jewish majority. In addition to that, the projections of fertility of the Palestinians are also lies, as are their immigration figures. The claim has been that the Palestinians are outproducing Jews, that Arabs are outproducing Jews or having more children than Jews. Well, that is not true. Jewish women in Israel have more children per capita than Palestinian Arab women have in Judea and Samaria. Jewish women in Israel have, on average today, and it keeps rising, 3.04 children, and Palestinian women in Judea and Samaria have 2.91 children on average, so that the Jewish fertility rates are high and rising, unprecedented in the entire Western world, these numbers. Nobody is above 3. Most people can't even get to 2. And the Palestinians are part of a larger collapse of fertility rates throughout the Islamic world. And just to give you an example, in Iran, at the time of the revolution in 1979, women were having almost 8 children per capita in Iran. Today they're having 1.6. This is a collapse of birth rates throughout the Islamic world that is unprecedented in human history, not only for the Islamic world, but for any country in the world. There has never been a collapse like this, and it is happening throughout. And the reason for this is quite simple. I mean, it's a pattern that goes through the entire world. There are 2 factors that cause drops in fertility rates worldwide: urbanization and women's education. The more urbanized a population become, the more educated women are, the fewer children they have. This is a process that's ongoing throughout the world. The same is happening in Iran and throughout the Arab world, in the Gulf states, in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen, and in Lebanon, and in the Palestinian Authority, and among Israeli Arabs. Urbanization and women's education causes a drop in fertility rates everywhere in the world except one place, Israel. Because it works out, Louis, that Jews know how to go forth and multiply. Yeah, I'm doing my part. And all of my, and I feel like an underachiever because all my girlfriends have 4 and 5 children. But, what?
I was going to talk to you.
Yeah, well, yes, I have, at any rate. Let's just put it this way. And then there's immigration rates. Everybody talked about mass Arab immigration into the Palestinian Authority, particularly when it was founded, and they were projecting immigration rates of 15,000 people per year. And what's happened is that year in, year out, they've had negative immigration rates. People are leaving in droves. The emigration rate of Palestinians out goes from anywhere between 20,000 a year and up to 80,000 a year. The numbers are sketchy because the Palestinian Authority is hiding them. But what we know from the Israeli civil administration, for instance, in 2008, I think it's in my book, I can't remember the precise numbers, but I think that it was 80,000 people wanting to leave. I mean, this is the numbers that are never remarked upon, but the Palestinians want to leave. Emigration rates were also incredibly high from the Gaza Strip until the Hamas takeover and the sealing of the international borders as a consequence. So we're talking about demographic data upon which the U.S. State Department and the Obama administration are basing their policies, or at least justifying them, saying,
why that emigration is happening. Why are they leaving Israel? Because they have a better life there than in a lot of other
no, not Israeli Arabs are not emigrating. Palestinian Arabs are emigrating out of the West Bank. They're moving to Europe, and they're moving to the Gulf because of better economic opportunities in large part. And they're leaving. I mean, look, one of the things that I discuss in my book is the human rights situation in the PLO-ruled Palestinian Authority, forgetting Gaza, which is ruled by Hamas, which is, of course, even worse in many regards, where you have forced conversion to Islam of the ancient Christian community of Gaza. But here, in Judea and Samaria, I mean, you have massive persecution of the Christians. Everybody forgets about the siege of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem in 2002. But even before that, I mean, when Arafat came in 1996 to Bethlehem, he set up his headquarters in a monastery next to the Church of the Nativity. So, I mean, that was an act of utter contempt of the Christians of Bethlehem. And as a consequence, you've seen the Christians move from a majority of the population of Bethlehem to 10% of the population of Bethlehem today. And they say that there are more residents of Beit Jala, which is a Christian suburb of Bethlehem, in Chile today than there are in Beit Jala. They're just leaving because they're being persecuted. You don't have property rights, your property rights aren't protected, so you have Muslims who were persecuting the Christian families, for instance, who had shops on Manger Square in Bethlehem, who forced them out and took over their stores. So that the people who are operating the concessions by the Church of the Nativity are, in many cases, the people who forced out the proprietors of those stores because they were Christian. Now, the situation isn't that much better for the Muslims, because what we saw with the Palestinian Authority, and let's not forget, by the way, their human rights records on Jews, okay? I mean, the first act of legislation that the PLO undertook when they formed the Palestinian Authority was to reinstate the Jordanian law, making it a capital offense to sell land to Jews, right? I mean, this is something that is evil, right? That says that Jews aren't allowed to have rights to property, and anybody who sells their land to a Jew is going to be killed. And what we've seen is not only judicial execution of land sellers, but mainly extrajudicial executions of land sellers by members of Fatah. That is, members of the ruling faction that's supposed to be moderate in the Palestinian Authority, the ruling faction that Mahmoud Abbas, who is supposed to be moderate, is the head of. So you've had dozens and dozens of Palestinians who sold their land to Jews winding up dead in dumpsters in Jerusalem or in culverts on the side of the Jerusalem-Jericho highway, and on and on and on. And what they did in order to ensure that people would be deterred is that they also put out a fatwa, an Islamic ruling that said that Muslims who sell land to Jews will not be allowed to be buried in a Muslim cemetery. So you have these people who are dumped on the side of the road and then they can't be buried. So, this is an extraordinary act of social excommunication, and not to mention persecution. And that's in relation to Jews. But in relation to the Muslims themselves, I mean, what has governed the Palestinian Authority since Arafat formed it in Judea and Samaria and Gaza in 1994 is the law of the jungle. Because the first thing that he did was he abrogated, the two things that he did at the same day were the death penalty for selling land to Jews. And the second thing was that he canceled all of Israel's military orders from 1967 to 1994. And these weren't orders saying, you know, like, curfew from whatever to whatever. No such thing. It was trying to update the Jordanian laws so that they were applicable to the lives of people who lived in Judea and Samaria on a daily basis. So it may have been planning and zoning, education, mandatory education, judicial processes. I mean, these were civil laws, but because these areas were under military rule, they were enacted as military orders as opposed to laws. And so when you canceled that, what you did was you canceled the legal code and you transformed what had been the areas under Israeli military governance had been ruled in the most liberal manner from a legal perspective of any areas in the Arab world into areas that were ruled by the arbitrary rule of the PLO, and anything that they said go, and people lost all of their property rights protections and their legal rights protections and their human rights protections. You've had persecutions of journalists and editors who will speak out against the Palestinian Authority on anything, particularly on corruption, but basically on anything. You have Palestinian journalists who are languishing in prison for having Facebook pages criticizing Abbas. And, you know, this is the human rights record of these people. So why would you want to leave? Why would you want to stay? You know, if you're educated, if you have any ability to find employment elsewhere and to build a life for yourself and your family outside of an area where you're subjected to that kind of persecution, you'll take it. So, you know, I know you guys have to vote. So the last thing that I want to leave you with is that, you know, people are afraid of fallout. How will people respond? How will the Arabs respond? How will the Europeans respond? Why is this good for the United States? Won't everybody be angry at the United States? So 2 points on that issue. First one is that the two-state solution is predicated on the view that what's wrong with the Middle East is Israel, because everything bad in the Middle East owes to the root cause of it all, which is the absence of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan. And that means that the party most responsible for all the pathologies of the Arab world is Israel, which, due to its greed for land, will not move enough in order to enable the establishment of that state. So that everybody who truly believes in the two-state solution also believes that Israel is a strategic liability to the United States of America, and that the United States doesn't have to worry about al-Qaeda or Iran's nuclear weapons program or about the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood or about what's happening in Syria, because at the end of the day, the only party that has to do something is the Jews. Because if Israel will just quit Judea and Samaria and Gaza, deny property rights to Jews because they're Jewish in those areas, that is, enact an anti-Semitic policy, then everything will be fine. And it doesn't matter what happens with the Muslim Brotherhood and the doctrines of jihad and you know, the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood. None of this is important, because the only thing that matters is that there's no Palestinian state, and the only party responsible for that is Israel. Now, this is not only anti-Semitic, it's also, as most anti-Semitic things are, irrational. And as a consequence, the United States simply can't understand the region. It cannot put together policies that are coherent, because those policies are based upon a fundamental misconception of reality. And so, for instance, when I was embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division, for me, coming from Israel and going into Kuwait and looking at what was about to happen, it was obvious to me that the relevant analogy was Lebanon in 1982, from a demographic perspective, from a military perspective, from the perspective of outside powers coming in and messing things up, Syria and Iran. It was all almost identical. And yet, because the United States thought that Israel was the problem, none of the military planners in the DoD paid any attention to the precedent of Israel in Lebanon, either in 1982 or subsequently until we left our security zone in southern Lebanon in 2000, and the aftermath, which was the Hezbollah takeover of Lebanon, not only of southern Lebanon, but of all of Lebanon. And nobody thought of that. Because Israel is an occupier, we're coming in as liberators, nobody will think of us the way that they thought of the Israelis. One-to-one, every single thing that happened to Israel and Lebanon happened to the United States, and it happened to the United States within weeks. The infantry division that I was embedded with suffered from a car bombing outside of Najaf. I think it was 8 days after the invasion. 4 men were killed, and the Palestinians named a public square in Ramallah after the Iraqi NCO who conducted the car bombing at a roadblock on the highway. And so it was so obvious. It was so easy to understand, and yet this blindness that the United States has placed upon itself through its adoption of the two-state paradigm that puts all the blame for everything that happens on Israel, on its primary ally, had blinded the United States to the strategic realities of Iraq, and I argue made it very, very difficult for them to come up with a coherent and rational policy for what was awaiting them in that country. Why bother understanding everything, which, Dick Armitage wrote to Doug Feith at the time, well, I don't think we can even invade Iraq until there's progress in the peace process. So, I mean, it bespeaks an incredible ignorance. And then the final thing that I want to say about this is, from an American perspective, you have a foreign policy that right now, and I dare say in the waning years of the Bush administration as well, was based upon a notion that it's good to be bad to your friends and good to your enemies. Because, maybe we're too assertive, we're too aggressive, and our enemies are angry because of things that we've done. We can appease them by pressuring Israel. We can appease them by giving up Georgia. We can appease them by making China feel comfortable as it rises. Well, this doesn't work. For instance, well, I didn't want to say it. I figured everybody had that analogy in there. But you're right. And the problem is that doesn't work. So when you're trying to think forward, what should we do? What could be a foreign policy that works for the United States? The obvious answer is be good to your allies and bad to your enemies, because then people will want to be your allies and they won't want to be your enemies. And today in the Middle East, the United States, as a result of the revolutionary wave going through and overthrowing government after government, and also as a result of U.S. policies that has been so myopic in terms of embracing Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood, the United States has only one ally that it can rely upon, and that's Israel. And the starting point for rebuilding American foreign policy, the most important starting point, because everybody's looking at the way that the United States treats Israel, because Israel is so hated, and it's hard to be friends with Israel in this environment, is how is the United States going to treat Israel? And if the United States is able to return to strategic sanity and recognize that the two-state solution is deleterious not only to Israel but also to the United States and the coherence of its foreign policy, abandons that path and embraces one that embraces Israel as a strategic ally, which it is, and which it has always been, and seeks an Israel that can be as strong as possible, that the impact of such a policy on how the United States is perceived throughout the world will be dramatic and positive. And it far from making the Arabs angry at the United States, all of the spurned allies in the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia and on, will look at that and say, look, the United States is standing with Israel, maybe we can trust them again. And that is extraordinarily important. And the same will be going for Latin American allies, the same will be going for East Asian allies and European allies. And I think that would be the place to start. So I think that my book, not only specifically to Middle East, is important, but I think that it provides a policymaking framework that can be applied throughout the world. And again, starting with Israel because of the critical nature of that alliance and also the vulnerability that Israel suffers from as a result of its location and the fact that it's Jewish. So those are my thoughts. And I want to thank him and the David Horowitz Freedom Center for sponsoring this event. You know, as Congresswoman Bachmann said, this is what I'm trying to do with my book is start a conversation. I don't have McDonald's view of foreign policy. Rome wasn't built in a day. And we shouldn't be expecting instant gratification from things that we do abroad, although I think that I would get instantly gratified, for instance, if we were to knock out Iran's nuclear installations. But beyond that, you know, there's very few things that we do in our lifetimes that we receive instant results from. And what I think we need to do now is take a policy that is completely irrational and indeed dangerous, and begin to discuss it on a factual basis, on the basis of true knowledge, and on the basis of the truth. Whether it's Israel's historic rights to Judea and Samaria that shows that the Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel, whether it's the international legal basis for Israel's claims, which are stronger under binding international law than the Palestinians are under the constructs of the right to self-determination. All of these things, as well as from a strategic perspective and a demographic perspective that I bring to bear in my book, as well as my recommended policy, which is for Israel to apply its sovereignty throughout Judea and Samaria and offer permanent residency status to the Palestinians who live there, all of these things are facts. And if you have a foreign policy based upon facts, you're already starting to have a foreign policy as opposed to a disaster that is just happening before your eyes. And I think, you know, that for me, that is the most important thing. Look, you know, I mean, I've been going to all of these offices of the members who are so generous with handing out candy, you know, and so I have Skittles, and I have Starburst, and I have Snickers, and I have Hershey's in my bag, and I'm thinking, and I was laughing with Ben Lerner from the Center for Security Policy, who has been organizing all these events for me during the day, and saying, maybe I should have a salad. You know, I mean, these candies, they are delicious, but they make you sick. You know, they're bad for you. Why don't we put them away and wait until my children turn 12, and then I can give them one Skittle. You know, but I mean, really, we have to be serious. We have to understand that this, oh, let's have balloons and doves coming out of nets and things like that to prove what great foreign policy brilliant people we are. You know, it's not a way forward. It's a way to disaster. You have to think through things. You have to understand what your values are. You have to think about what they mean to you, and you have to really, really consider what your national security interests are. And you have to be basing a national security on all of those things. It's not rocket science, but looking at where the United States is today, it really is night and day comparison. No, what I say we have to do in Judea and Samaria for the 1.6 million Palestinians, up to 1.6 million who live there, is we have to reinstate the precedent that we have, the successful precedents that we've had with applying Israeli law to Jerusalem, to united Jerusalem after the '67 war, and in the Golan Heights in 1981. Which involves giving them permanent residency status and the right to apply for citizenship. That doesn't mean that they have the right to be naturalized. There's a difference. Today they don't have the right to apply for citizenship at all. But I don't foresee either them applying, because in Jerusalem and in the Golan Heights they only began applying for citizenship when they were afraid that Israel was going to be leaving. So that until 1994, nobody practically in Jerusalem applied for Israeli citizenship. And after 1994, in different spikes, you had people lining up around the block outside of the Ministry of the Interior to get Israeli citizenship because they don't want to live under a Palestinian sovereignty. In the Golan Heights, they only began applying for citizenship when the Syrian civil war began. So when they're afraid of something happening elsewhere, and they're afraid that Israel will disengage or leave, then they apply. There's no act that Israel could do that would be more clear, that would more clearly show that it has no intention of leaving than applying Israeli law to Judea and Samaria. And as a consequence, and also due to the fact that people who apply for Israeli citizenship are immediately castigated as traitors, I think that the number of Palestinians who would apply for Israeli citizenship would be minimal, would be extremely small. Aside from that, I mean, not most, I don't know most, many Palestinians wouldn't be eligible for Israeli citizenship because of their past or current membership in terrorist organizations, and because of their past or current involvement in anti-Semitic incitement, whether as school teachers in Palestinian schools, or as preachers in mosques, or or as students involved with clubs that call for the annihilation of Israel. So, these are reasonable limits on citizenship that any democratic country enacts in order to protect itself. So I don't consider that to be more than a policy challenge. I think that the film itself is extremely effective, and so I think that the more people who receive the film, the better. I'm not sure how effective J Street has been on Capitol Hill. I think they have been effective among Democrats, but I think that's largely a consequence as well as the Obama administration's support for J Street. I mean, the Obama administration has been instrumental in making J Street perceived as a major force in the American Jewish community. And absent that administration support, I'm not sure how important it would be. And when we see things like Senator Menendez, stripping acts in the Foreign Affairs Committee on the Senate that are objected to by the White House on Iran's nuclear weapons program. And we see that it's very hard for Democratic members of the House or the Senate to stand up to administration objections. I think as a consequence, J Street would be very important to get into the hands of Democratic members of Congress. But I don't think that J Street would be the threat that it manifests today unless without the support of the White House.
I'd like to say something.
Yes.
I want to say on behalf of AMET, the Endowment for Middle East Truth, I'm the founder and president of that, Sarah Stern, and on behalf of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, it's an honor and a privilege to have Carolyn here to speak the truth, which is really, really refreshing in these corridors. I think Carolyn had mentioned, the old phrase that when you're in a hole, you stop digging.
Right.
And we've seen over and over again. I remember July 25th, 2000, when it was that Arafat walked away from the negotiating table with Ehud Barak. And then in 2008, they used that as a base and upped the ante from there and what the Palestinians would demand. And the Palestinians, again, Abu Mazen walked away from the negotiating table with Ehud Olmert. And then they used that as a base, and just now, this April 29th deadline came and went, and they took everything that was offered, and they tried to up the ante again. So it doesn't look, that, we have realized that this paradigm of land for peace just doesn't seem to be working when it comes to the Palestinian Authority. And what we are doing is just feeding the crocodile. And Winston Churchill saying that those who feed the crocodile are only eaten last. So we are so honored to have a clear thinker, a voice of truth and reason for a change, who has the courage not only to show about, to describe what's been wrong with the current paradigm, but to put forth another one. And it's always easier to criticize than it is to present something of your own. And any woman who could go to Iraq, embedded, with the U.S. Army as a journalist, and who can, raise 2 children on her own, I think might have the courage to take on the U.S. State Department. And I'm really, really proud to call Carolyn a member of our Board of Advisors and a dear friend and a speaker of truth. By the way, Emet means truth in Hebrew, and we're all about the truth. So thank you,
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. And also your friendship and all of the important work you do here and everywhere, spreading the word. I think one of the things that we have to understand is that there is a lot from an Israeli perspective, and coming to the United States. I've been here now. This is the 3rd month of our sojourn here as I push out this book, and we won't be leaving until the end of July. And it's hard to believe how pessimistic people are about Israel. And the reason why it's hard to understand is because Israel is the most optimistic place on earth. And things are you know, knock wood, they're going really well. I mean, we had the vice premier of China in Israel this week with hundreds of Chinese businessmen who are trying to sign deals with every Israeli who they meet. You know, a Chinese university just signed a $300 million deal with Tel Aviv University to develop a joint research center. And so, yes, you know, you have universities in the United States that are pushing for divestment from Israel and boycott of Israeli universities, but then in Asia, in China, in India, Modi was just elected prime minister. This is the guy who thinks that, you know, Israel is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You know, I mean, this is a completely different thing. When Israel started the peace process with the Palestinians with the PLO in 1993, I mean, Israel was only beginning its market reforms. We were absorbing 1.1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and happening at the same time, and it was very hard to cope. Today, Israel is one of the most advanced economies in the world, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. We're expanding our markets throughout the world, and Israelis are becoming increasingly educated. It seems like every year another college opens up. We're having more children, which is a sign of extraordinary optimism by any measure. It's a happy country. And we come here and we see that pro-Israel students on campus are being just abused. And you have rising forces like J Street that are being completely taken out of the mainstream of the Israeli body politic because people think that they're lunatics. And it's a very sobering experience to come here and see how little Americans understand about how wonderful Israel has become and how successful and how happy. And the reason, I think, is because of the two-state paradigm. I mean, most Israelis think that when you ask Israelis what the most important items on their agenda for the coming year, which we do these polls every Independence Day, we just celebrated Independence Day a couple of weeks ago. Everybody's saying the housing prices is horrible, economic inequality is really bad. Only 7% of Israelis thought that the most urgent issue on our agenda is making peace with the Palestinians. And these positions are just inexplicable to Americans because the only thing that Israel is ever seen as is a party to the peace process, or a victim of or vulnerable to an Iranian nuclear war, and it's reviled because there's no progress in the peace process. It's pitied because of Iran or because of anger over Iran, that Israel thinks that Iran has to be taken care of and the Americans want to appease them. So I think that so much of this is owes to the two-state paradigm, because the two-state paradigm says that really Israel doesn't have an existence independent of the Palestinians and of the peace process. And the most important thing and the most urgent thing for Israel to accomplish is establish a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River in Judea and Samaria, Jerusalem, and Gaza that's controlled by Hamas. And Israelis just don't see anything like that. We don't believe it, we don't feel it, which is why our last elections were about completely different things. The Palestinians almost never came up in the election. And we can't get past this. We can't get past this divide for as long as Israel isn't asserting its rights to Judea and Samaria. We can't get past this until until Americans realize that this two-state solution is a loser. They're not blinded by this two-state thing. I think that the Americans as well will finally be able to gain the full advantage of its strategic alliance with Israel on every level, and I think that being pro-Israel in America certainly will be a much more pleasant experience, and it should be, because Israel should only be a cause, it really is only a cause of celebration, of concern, of worry, of course, but it's just such an extraordinary place. We are fulfilling our promise of the ingathering of exiles. We're doing it. We've moved from a country full of communities of people from different countries into a nation in just 3 generations. And aside from being a miracle, it's exciting and fun and inspiring. And these are the kinds of things that Americans who love Israel and support Israel should really be feeling at all times. I mean, Israelis do. And bringing that to America is also important. The Israeli Solution is a very optimistic book. It has to be because I'm optimistic and I wrote it. And I think that you'll find when you read it that there's such a cause for optimism and excitement about the prospects for Israel. And there is a reason to be bold and courageous because we can surmount these challenges and we can meet them. And we are every day on so many different things, and we can do it on this as well. So those are my remarks.